Good morning, guys. I just want to go over some of the stuff that you guys have been learning this week, making sure that you have a good understanding of everything. This week's little review, we kind of started with the hemoglobin blast. And when you did the hemoglobin blast, we took a look at two different types of representation. You had to try to pick between them based off of the evidence that you saw. So the evidence that you guys did was you compared a lot of the DNA, and you found that humans, their DNA was most closely related to the chimpanzees, and least closely related to the gorillas and the common ancestors. So when you had to justify which of these two types of setups you wanted to look at, you had to keep that in mind. So if we take a look at this first one, this is implying the fact that all three of these species diverge from a common ancestor at one particular time. So we would assume that there would be equal amounts of DNA in common then if they split at the same time. In this one, we have a common ancestor here. And again, we have a split from gorillas to a common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. And then there was another split here of a common ancestor between the chimpanzee and the human. So it shows that the human and the chimpanzee are actually most closely related with one type of common ancestor. And then humans and chimpanzees are closely related to gorillas when it comes to this particular common ancestor. So when you took a look at your data, this one best represented the data that you had seen displayed to you. So again, humans and chimpanzees are more closely related to each other with a common ancestor that they have in common from a closer time than the common ancestor from the past. So we can see this again with other organisms. The more genetic characteristics two species share, the more recently they actually shared that common ancestor. So when we look back, humans and chimpanzees most recently shared a common ancestor together than they did with gorillas. So they are more closely related in evolutionary terms. Now, that does not mean that we directly evolved from chimpanzees. That was the main point and purpose of that activity. We want to try to nip that misconception. We did not directly evolve from chimpanzees. We have a common ancestor. So if we take a look here, raccoons, red pandas, giant pandas, and bears. The giant pandas and bears are more closely related with a common ancestor. Red pandas and raccoons are most closely related with a common ancestor. And then all four species share a common ancestor that goes way, way back further. So if we were to take a look at the DNA separately, we would expect raccoons and red pandas to have DNA that looks way more similar to each other than if you were to compare the raccoon to the bear. So how do species formed? You started to get into this then more Wednesday and Thursday. So species can form in different ways. You don't have to have these memorized. They're just there to help you, but some of them are geographic isolation, behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, and adaptive radiation. There's a couple others as well. It all changes and depends on kind of who you're talking to. But what is a species? A species is a group of organisms that are able to interbreed and basically reproduce as long as they're around each other. So we can see this going in different ways. So geographic isolation is the first one. If you have a physical barrier that divides two populations, those two populations are going to stop reproducing. The longer and longer and longer they stop reproducing, the more different their DNA is going to start to become because their gene pool has started to adjust to the reproductive change. As a result, those populations eventually start to contain organisms that aren't going to interbreed. And if enough time passes, they probably never will again. So some examples of that are mountains, rivers or channels in between islands, all of that stuff. Lava flows can be set down and cause a barrier as well. So if we think about this in terms of these cute little squirrels, these two cute little guys are part of the Grand Canyon. They are two separate species. If you look at their names, they even have different species names. They look similar, but they don't interbreed. And one of the reasons they don't interbreed is because they can't get to each other anymore. And they haven't been able to get to each other for quite a long time, so therefore they stopped breeding. So if we take a look at this, we have the gene flow. The thicker era means that they're able to actually reproduce. So when the Grand Canyon was a super, super small little creek, the Colorado River cut in between, they were able to get back and forth, and breed. Eventually, that little creek started to cut a cavern. And over time, that cavern got bigger and wider. And some squirrels could get back and forth to breed, but others couldn't. So over time, the gene flow started to change. And these guys were mainly staying on their side of the canyon. These guys were staying on their side of the canyon and not really interbreeding. So after the last few squirrels were able to actually, head down and around the canyon, they stopped completely. And this group on the one side of the Grand Canyon continued to breed amongst themselves, while this side continued to breed amongst themselves. They started to develop different communication styles. Maybe they had different interests. Maybe they looked a little bit differently. So over time, those populations changed. If you were to put these two squirrels with each other today, they would not breed with each other. Maybe they don't speak the same breeding language anymore. They clearly maybe don't look the same or have the same attractions. But there's been enough that's changed that they are now two separate species. Now, would gene flow across this canyon and hawks be influenced by the same manner? Hopefully you said no, because hawks can fly. So geographic barriers are very different for them. The Grand Canyon would not pose a geographic barrier. So certain organisms are more affected by geographic barriers than others. Think plants. Another one is behavioral isolation. Preventing two species from mating. This happens in your backyard. There are plenty of birds in your backyard and they don't breed with each other. They look a little bit differently. They have different attractions. They have different songs that they sing. So the behavioral isolation is something that starts to get developed. Again, if you're separating yourself long enough and you start to have your new and your own communication style, chances of you breeding with somebody who has a different type of communication style is going to be very minimal. So although the eastern and the western meadowlarks look similar, their mating songs are very different. These birds won't normally reproduce with each other. So over generations, they continue to not mate, and then eventually you end up with two different species. For the longest time, they're not mating, so they stop mating. Another one is called temporal isolation, and this is the reproduction that occurs at different times of the year. So these two frogs, they look somewhat similar, but the wood frog, they start their mating activities in the earlier spring, and the leopard frog does his in later spring. So mating time isn't the same for these organisms, or maybe one's nocturnal and one isn't. But those are also differences that will change quite a bit of what's going on in the reproductive processes of different species. So even though organisms might look the same, maybe they speak a different language, maybe they breed at different times, maybe they are out and about in different times during the day, nocturnal versus, somebody who stays out in the day. But again, you don't see the blue jay outside reproducing with the cardinal. They have different languages, have different interests, aren't around the same areas maybe of the tree. So their interactions are separated in some way, shape, or form. Adaptive radiation is something that you saw in the anole lizard lab, and we see this with Darwin's finches as well. So I wanted to go over this again. And basically, Darwin's finches, he visited island after island, and he noticed that all of these guys were finches, but they had different beaks, and those beaks were used for different tools to get to their food sources. They all did come from a common ancestor, so they did share some common DNA, but again, it was starting to become a little bit distant. So how does this happen? Well, it's something called adaptive radiation. When the first bird left from the mainland and made it to the first island, it made its home there. And that species made its home, maybe it's found its niche, it started eating worms and was happy-go-lucky and all of that. Well then, again, maybe then some of his buddies, his ancestors or part of his family, left and they took off to go to the next island. Well, when they went off to the next island, they started to then make their own species there. They probably weren't flying back and forth frequently to breed, but they could have. So species A evolves then into species B. So species B is here. We've got some birds that are going to be on this new island. If some of these birds go back, maybe by that point they've picked up a new niche. Maybe they don't eat worms like the first group. Maybe they eat bugs. So again, they're not going to mingle as much. Found their own place. So then we've got another species here. Some of these guys move on and move to the next island. Some stay on the second island. Some go back to the first island. Again, they start to establish their own place within those islands. And then eventually we start to see variation on every island of the different types of birds or the different types of lizards in the case of the Anoles Lizard Lab. So in the Anoles Lizard Lab, we saw many different species that were found on each island, and it worked the same way as this. However, they're lizards, they're not birds, so they didn't fly from island to island. Chances are they probably were transported. Maybe they were pets, maybe they were in people's luggage, in the bottom of boats that were going from island to island, but they were transported somehow from island to island. But they all eventually established their place on that island. So in Cuba here, and if you take a look in every other island, the orangey, skinny lizards seem to be closer to the ground. Okay, well, on a lot of these islands, we've got sand and clay. Makes sense that the lighter colored lizards are going to live closer to the ground, and that the green lizards are probably going to be closer to the tops of the trees where we have more leaves. So we get that, but again, this happened due to natural selection. So when this guy got here, he knew that if he was running up here into the top of the canopy, he was going to get eaten. And if he gets eaten, he doesn't pass on his genes. So eventually, over time, colors that were not green were not favorable and started to reduce in the populations of the lizards found up in the tops of the trees. Same thing happens down here. Lizards that were a greener color, or maybe some of these bluer ones, were less favorable in that environment and therefore would get eaten very quickly. And then most of the lizards that you would find in the bottom locations had a better selective advantage if they were that sandier, reddish yellow color or pinkish yellow color. And so therefore the populations of lizards that we typically see on the ground happen to be that color. They didn't just move into the island and say, well, I'm green, so I'm living up here. It didn't work that way. This happened over a long period of time. So that eventually, if this lizard stays up here and doesn't ever chill with any of these guys, because, he would probably get eaten if he moved down here, he started to breed only with other lizards at the tops of the trees. And nobody else seemed to come up to the top of the trees by him, so there wasn't interbreeding occurring. So eventually, this became its own species. Just like this guy became its own species, his own species, and his own species. He's not coming up here to breed with him. He's not going down here to breed with him. So because they stayed isolated in their own little environments, their own locations on the trees, they created their own species, just like the birds in your backyard. They all live in the trees, but they have different communications, different times of the day they come out, different locations on the tree that they live in, so they don't interact all the time. And therefore they don't breed with each other. So when you went through this, you were also given two hypotheses. Do you believe that all of the green lizards that live on the tops of the trees are more closely related? Or do you think all the lizards in one island are most closely related? And when looking at that, we have your phylogenetic tree here. And what we found out is that, take a look, all of the orange are most closely related with a common ancestor. Orange is all the Puerto Rican lizards. The purples are most closely related to each other. All the purples are the Cuban lizards. So it didn't matter what the lizard looked like or where in the trees the lizard lived. Lizards found on the same exact island were more closely related to each other and came from common ancestry that branched off over time. Okay? So that's important to understand when looking at that particular lab. So hopefully you have a better understanding of species You have a better understanding of the labs that we've done this week. Again, if you have questions, please put them in